Welcome to Lessons That Last, where a researcher and a teacher talk about what it means to make a lasting impact on students' lives. They unpack the stories former students shared about their memorable teachers and discuss how we can all make a greater impact on the people in our lives. Here's Julie and Laura.
Hello and welcome back to the Lessons That Last podcast. I'm Julie Hassan, educational researcher, professor, and resilience trainer. And with me is my co-host and poet,
Laura Estes Willie. I am a reader, a writer, a teacher, and very definitely a poet.
And as we are sending this pod out into the world, we're a couple days away from National Poetry Month in April, which I know is your favorite month of the year.
Listen, Poetry Month is a very big deal in my life. So if you're listening right now, grab a friend, join us, have a seat. You want to get in on this National Poetry Month.
I feel like we should do this whole episode in rhyme. Stanzas?
No. Julie, all poems do not have to rhyme.
I think I heard Joni Mitchell say that.
And
on the documentary I was watching.
Right? Stanzas are up to you to choose. There's so much freedom in poetry. It's one of the reasons I love teaching it. I love writing it because you have so much to choose from. You know, you can choose from anything that's in your imagination. There are no rules. You make them.
You know, I love a good haiku.
Oh, yeah.
Because that one does have rules, and maybe that feels a little safer to me.
It is safer, for sure.
To know how many words and how many syllables feels a little less, wide open and scary.
Yes. I get that for sure. I used to really enjoy when I taught kind of different genres of poetry, having kids write haiku to their former self, haiku to their future selves. And so breaking away maybe from some of the rules where it has to be about nature and express a truth about life, but using that format in a different or maybe more engaging way for some writers.
I'm thinking, both of my kids had U for creative writing in high school. And I'm thinking one of them wrote a haiku about a cat.
Well, one of them wrote about a beautiful putting green. Yes.
That
and
resonates.
One of them did write about a cat, and it was on my board. It was a moment.
Yes. Well, the one who writes about golf, which let's be honest, is the love of his life.
Yes.
Probably wouldn't make a big show of it on the board, but the one who would write about a cat would not mind.
No, she was happy to share it with the world.
Being in the spotlight.
Yes.
And that one has a much more poetic soul.
She does have a poetic soul.
And the golfer.
Yes.
But there's some art, I guess, to putting and putting greens. Everybody has their art, right?
And listen, he can wax poetically about a putting green. I'm going to be honest with you. The sun and the green and the smells. He could do it.
And the clink.
It was beautiful.
Clink into the cup with the whole.
Yep.
I guess we all find beauty in different places.
Yes. Yes.
Now, this story comes from a woman remembering her third grade teacher. And I'm wondering, do you remember reading books, not necessarily poetry books, but maybe any specific books that you loved as a kid about that age?
So I was obsessed. I probably right around that age with the Bobbsey twins. Did you read the Bobbsey twins?
I did. I more loved books with animal characters. I'm thinking The Mouse and the Motorcycle and Mr. Popper's Penguins and anything that had animals in it was more my thing.
So the Bobbsey Twins was a series, and as soon as you finished one, you could pick up another one, and they were cute, and they were solving mysteries, but not scary. They were probably the original cozy mystery from the 70s. And I devoured those. I felt like I knew those kids because there was one set of twins that were my age or a little younger, and one set of twins that were a little older. So there was something to aspire to and something to identify with. And then I also really was very passionate about Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, all through pretty much most of my life. I think I just always loved the sweet simplicity of that story. And I also loved the sisterhood. I was an only child until I was 13. And it was just a life I could not imagine, having all those sisters. And there's always someone there with you to talk to play with, to cry with. And so Little Women gave me a taste of that.
I love that book too.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you picked this story about poetry books I loved as a kid and always had poetry anthologies. My mom is a teacher, so we had tons of books. She read to us every night. We had records that were books on tape, you name it. There was reading going on in our house, and certainly poetry. Shel Silverstein, always like a favorite, and so many great poems in his books. I'm trying to think who else I love. Maurice Sendak, like Chicken Soup with Rice, really Rosie. And then Carole King, of course, recorded those set to music. And that was always one of my favorite records as a kid, was Carole King doing all the really Rosie poems.
Yes, I did love, as a younger reader, not once we got into chapter books, but when we were reading the smaller books, so many books for children are written in verse. There's so much poetry in children's literature, structurally, yes, but also freely rhyming. I just really always loved the beauty of that rhythm of language.
And I still loved, I don't get to read out loud to kids as much as I used to, but I still love children's books.
Yeah.
There's such an economy of words, and so each word is so carefully chosen and so important and meant to paint a picture for a child. There's so many beautiful books that are children's books.
True.
And then when you get a great illustrator, like, forget it.
Yes. Yes. I know. It's a marriage. It's a perfect marriage of two really, really important art forms.
So you picked Jennifer's story about Mrs. Rosen's classroom today. Speaking of kids who remember fondly teachers and books. So would you, Laura, share Jennifer's story about her third grade teacher, Mrs. Rosen?
I would love to. I loved picture books as a young child. I remember the book displays in my third grade classroom, which Mrs. Rosen would change according to topic or season. She even had a special shelf where she would display several books by the same author, along with the author's picture and personal facts. It was the first time I realized books are written by people, seemingly ordinary people like my mom and dad. I was amazed to discover that the authors of the books I loved had pets and plants and lived in houses. In the spring, our class learned about poetry, and poetry books filled Mrs. Rosen's displays. When it was time to write our own poems, I wrote about ants. Mrs. Rosen loved my poem and asked me to write it on a big piece of poster board. She let me draw an illustration on the bottom. I was thrilled when she took a picture and included it in our class newsletter. I was a real author, and my poem had been published. I still love books and proudly call myself an author. Several of my short stories and poems have appeared in literary magazines. While it is always exciting to see my work in print, nothing will ever match the excitement of seeing that ant poem in the class newsletter.
Oh, I love that.
I do too. I love Jennifer's writer soul here, but I am so impressed with Mrs. Rosen and how she brought writing alive to these kids. It's amazing.
And I love that she showed them that authors are people.
Yes.
And that was one of my favorite things to do as a second grade teacher is have an author of the month and really talk about where that author lives and things about their lives, because especially for children's book authors, you can find that information and you can find their pictures. And I remember one month, and I should have prepped for this better because now I can't remember who the author is, but it was an author of color. And one of my kiddos said to me, I thought all authors were old white women. And it was such a moment where we had to sit down and talk about there are all kinds of people who write, and anybody can be a writer, and everybody deserves to have their voice out into the world. But that moment was such an interesting moment for me because it hadn't occurred to me that kids, sort of like when we ask them about a scientist and they have this certain image in mind,
Right.
that for them, they thought, oh, children's books is some old white woman, probably who seems like a teacher, right? Who writes all these books. But if we look at Shel Silverstein, as we just talked about, or somebody, I mean, that's certainly not, who they are. It's not their identity. So thinking about how do we help kids know authors of all different identities is really important too.
And I think that's interesting in second grade, because if you talked to a reader in 11th grade, they would tell you that all authors are dead white men. So it's very similar.
It's true. And yet, James Baldwin, I mean, think about all the amazing authors who we have to make sure we expose our students to so that they know that there are authors of so many different identities. I think maybe we're doing a better job now in some places. You're in Florida. We won't talk about that because I will go on a rant that's probably not pod appropriate, but they need to hear those voices, and especially in poetry, all the different voices.
Well, let me tell you something that we're doing in Florida. I'm doing in Florida, and I would guess that thousands of other teachers are doing in Florida. I'm doing a choice read. So with my AP students, they have to choose what book they want to read. And I've given them a list, because if you give them wide open, it just takes too long. And on my list, there are 2 Florida approved choices that do not contain any of the things that we're not allowed to talk about. And the rest are real and good and solid.
Nice.
And because we've given you a choice, we're not handing you a book, right? We're not saying you have to read Toni Morrison's Beloved, because you can choose to read that, but you don't have to. Or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you don't have to read him, but you can. And so I think that that's one of the ways we can sort of wiggle a little bit and let kids also have choice. We've talked a lot about that on the pod, that it's so important to give them choice. So now they have choice, and they have informed choice. They know exactly what the books are basically about, the type of writers who created them, what is Florida approved. These are your Florida approved books. And so I'm really excited about that. I just introduced that to them before we left for spring break. So we'll be getting started on that just in time for Poetry Month.
Yay. That is cool. Oh, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how we can incorporate poetry into our classrooms, not just in April, but all through the year.
So I learned this really cool strategy early in my career. it was very strange. It was a College Board professional day at USF. So it was very strange. And we were in the College of Business, and we had to go around to different sessions. And I ended up in a session called Poetry Friday. And what they presented to us was a way to re-engage kids with poetry, because somehow we destroy poetry for our kids. Like I said, every book I read,
it's in the state test at the end of the year.
Right. Right.
Comprehension skills with poetry. There's nothing that will kill poetry like putting it in the end of the year test.
Exactly. And we loved poetry as kids. It's natural to love poetry. But by the time they get to, let's say, their senior year, when they come in for AP literature, a third of what we do is poetry. They don't like poetry and they're scared of poetry and they don't know how to approach a poetry. So what they presented to me, like this is what I took from this, is you need to introduce poetry to your students in a non-threatening, non-graded, open-ended way. And so I started, okay, let's go. Poetry Friday. I'm bringing you a poem. We'll read it. We'll talk about it. When you're done talking about it, we'll move on. And that was a simple act. And that is such an easy way to bring poetry into any classroom. But you have to be one of those teachers who's okay with some flux, right? So if I bring a poem into my first period and you talk about it all period, but in my sixth period, you only talk about it for 20 minutes, what do I do for the rest of those minutes, right? You have to have something up your sleeve, so to speak. So what I started incorporating in my Poetry Friday was, after we read and talk about the poem, if there's time, let's write a poem. Let's just write, give it a whirl. No grade. You're not turning anything in. Julie, I will not take your poem from you. Do you want to read it and share it with the class? Absolutely. Do you want to hang back and have me read it privately? Sure. But I'm never going to take it and I'm never going to grade it, because this is reintroducing poetry to you. And so I think that's one way that I have found my students get really sort of, I mean, some of them, I'm not going to pretend everyone falls in love with poetry again, but some of them get ignited by just that simple act. Some of them get comfortable. Some of them open the door a crack, right? So that's one way to bring poetry in.
Oh, I love that. And it is a memorable thing. Like, poetry is a memory maker. All through the Lessons That Last book, we talk about memorable moments in the classroom. And if I think back to my K-12 years, there are a couple of teachers I specifically remember because they loved poetry. One of them was my 8th grade science teacher, Mr. Tuning, and he loved Ogden Nash.
Yes.
Loved Ogden Nash.
I remember that.
And I can tell you to this day, a cow is of the bovine ilk, one in moo, the other milk. Like, in 8th grade.
Yes. And there's
40 years ago or more. And I had a high school teacher who loved Mary Oliver, and I still love Mary Oliver. I was telling you, I had a friend send me a video of Mary Oliver reading her poem about the geese. Oh, like my soul. So I have specific memories of poetry in classrooms of all different kinds of content. So if you want to make a memory, poetry is a beautiful way to do that.
It is. And the wonderful thing about poetry also is it's not all literary literature, right? Ogden Nash is silly. And you can find a poem about anything, literally anything, and bring that into your classroom. I was reading a poem with my students maybe a month ago, and in it talked about balance sheets, and they were like, we don't know what this is. And I was like, I know what this is because I know an accounting professor. So I was able to explain it to them. And then I shared it with Brian, and he was blown away by this poem because it was just really rich and beautiful. But it also had this image of balance sheets. And if you don't know what that is, you missed part of this poem, right?
There's the metaphor, right? Of life as a balance sheet.
There's so much poetry about history that there's almost no excuse not to bring it in now and then. into that study, that field of study. There's poetry about science. So I think I've mentioned on the pod before that I do a thing in March. It's March, April, called March Madness. And the students submit poetry, and the poems go head to head against each other until we pick the best poem of all time, basically.
Okay.
And last year, one of our final poems that really, it was a battle at the end, was about an astronomer and astronomy. There's beautiful poems about science. There's beautiful poetry about art. Across the board, anything you're studying, want to study, a new unit, you could start every unit with a poem that is relevant because it's out there.
I love that. And we would all be better humans if we spent a little time every now and then in poetry, don't you think? You would be.
I don't think that. I know it. I know that's
peaceful,
true.
Joyful, thoughtful,
deep thinking, deep feeling. Yeah. And we can find ourselves.
When we moved here to the woods, someone gave me a collection of Robert Frost poems.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny when you read things at different times in your life, you see different things in them and feel different ways. And I had always read Robert Frost, but somehow sitting in the middle of the woods reading Robert Frost as an adult is different. So the things you're introducing them to, they may reread again later and see differently, which is a beautiful thing about poetry.
And I will be honest, what Mrs. Rosen did with bringing poetry as in teaching poetry, but then also allowing the experience of writing poetry. And I'm sure she gave them some guidance or helped them realize that revision is part of writing and how can you make your poem better, all of that. She did something so important. I have students, hundreds of students over the years who have reflected back to me about a poem they wrote, not one that I brought them, not some great, awesome lesson or some Poetry Friday that lit them up, but a poem they wrote sitting in my classroom. And I may or may not have even read it at the time. It was a moment for them to express something in a new way. And it really was more true than it could have been true had it not been a poem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think like letting them write is so valuable. And that's such an important thing that Mrs. Rosen did for her students.
Yeah. I love that. And that you can connect it to kids' lives no matter what they're going through or their identities. And there's some beautiful Tupac poems that I know some high school teachers bring into the classroom, Roses in Concrete, and so many things that kids can relate to. So, Mrs. Rosen, thank you for inspiring us to add a little poetry to our classrooms and our lives. What a beautiful model and what a sweet memory Jennifer has of that time in that third grade classroom. So our challenge for them this week is to
find some poetry.
Yeah. Read it, write it, share it.
Yes.
Send it to us. We'd love a little poetry.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're looking for a poem for something specific and you can't find it, reach out to me. I will help you find a poem because I'm a poem whisperer. I can find them.
And if you want to recite some Ogden Nash, call me.
Exactly. We all have our specialties, right?
And if you're looking for a beautiful poem about a putting green on a golf course, we can hook you up with that as well.
We can. And if you love a cat, we have an in there too. We're all about resources here on the Lessons That Last podcast.
There is no topic too mundane for poetry.
Exactly. And
it will add a little spice to your teaching and your days. Yes. So thank you, friends, for joining us on this episode of the Lessons That Last podcast. If you are looking for Jennifer's story about Mrs. Rosen, I'm flipping through my papers. Oh no, Laura, I might have to tag team you.
I can because I've read it straight from the book today. And it is lesson 41 called Encouraging Growth.
Oh, I love that. So if you're reading along in the Lessons That Last book, you can find it there. If you want to read along in the Lessons That Last book, we will put the link to that book in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Have a beautiful poetic week, friends.
Thanks for spending this time with us, friends. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you will subscribe to the Lessons That Last podcast wherever you listen. Give us a rating too, which will help other listeners find us. And don't forget to visit chalkandchances.com for more stories. You can also find more information on Julie's research in books. While you're there, take the quiz to find out what kind of memorable teacher you are. I took it and was surprised by what I found. I think you'll find good food for thought. Let us know about your quiz results. We hope you will meet us here each week and bring a friend to share the conversation.